And with us now from the Wellington studio this evening, Colin Peacock from Mediawatch, his weekly catch-up here on Nights. Kia ora, Colin.
Kia ora, Mark. Yes, I've dodged the drooping and plunging street lamps of Wellington to safely be with you in the Wellington studio tonight.
Are you looking up as you walk down the street these days? Just making sure you don't have to catch something?
Always I'm looking sideways because I ride a bike, so I'm looking for the cars on my left and my right, the parked cars, the moving cars. Now I have to look up as well for the plunging street lamps, which poke out, into the little part of the road where you ride your bike on the left. So, full alertness at all times. I'm not afraid.
Well, Colin, last week the Prime Minister announced new rules on lobbying in the wake of Guy and Espina's RNZ series that exposed the lack of oversight on the trade. How has that story evolved since then?
It has evolved in some interesting ways, and forgive me if it seems a bit like last week's story in a way, but last week when you talked to Hayden on Midweek Mediawatch, you had Trump had been arrested, and I think the TVNZ boss had quit the day before or the day before that, and there was so much going on we didn't really talk about this. So let's just wind back a bit to last week. So the Prime Minister at his regular weekly post-cabinet press conference announced some immediate changes as a result, clearly, of the exposure of RNZ and Guy and Espina's series on lobbying. And then, first up, he said the privilege of swipe card access for many professional lobbyists at Parliament would end.
Where there are real questions at the moment is where the lobbying is taking place for a fee, and where there's a perception that some people who can afford to pay that fee are getting access to decision makers that others are not.
Walk us through what somebody can do with a lobbyist swipe pass at the current.
It gets them into the building, and it gets them into some parts, mostly public parts of the building. It doesn't get them into the parts, is my understanding, doesn't get them into, say, a minister's office, for example. They'd still have to be invited in and access that separately.
So why, I know you're doing all of this in a review. What's the point of these then?
That's a very good question. My view is that they can come through security the same as everybody else does.
So lobbyists having their own entry cards, which has been standard practice, it's been going on for years. So it's all changed now because Guy brought that to light.
I think so, and it's quite a remarkable rapid result. You don't often see a government or Prime Minister act quite so quickly on something as a result of a piece of journalism. Incidentally, in the Weekend Herald, they had a bit of a laugh about those lobbyists having to queue up like everybody else at the regular entrance for Jacinda Ardern's farewell festivities at Parliament. They were spotted there, and I think the journalists enjoyed that a little bit. But look, the bigger picture stuff, no action will be taken yet on that so-called revolving door between the government and the lobbying business. Guyan also described it as the cooling off period. I think that's what it's referred to overseas. So still at the moment, nothing to stop a cabinet minister or a former sort of political staffer going straight into the lobbying business, such as the former broadcasting minister Chris Farfoy did last year, almost no break. So the Ministry of Justice has been asked by the Prime Minister to review this. It'll take a while. And in the meantime, Chris Hipkins did also push forward the idea of a voluntary agreement whereby lobbyists can publicly disclose in some sort of register who they represent, but all that somewhere in the future. But the swipe card thing, took place immediately.
And it intersects with the media, doesn't it, really? Because some lobbyists appear as commentators. That's one of the things that Guyan series actually pointed out.
Yes, he did. And this week, Guyan spoke a bit more about that on the New Zealand Herald's daily podcast called The Front Page. And look, he in previous interviews he's given with other media about this, he spoke quite frankly about lobbyists being part of the media ecosystem and as commentators and pundits, but he also said, journalists interact with them, and he himself and others, his peers, back in his days as a political editor, he'd accepted some of their blandishments and corporate boxes at sports events and that sort of thing. But what he was saying really was that lobbyists, communicate with advisors in ministers' office, messaging them directly sometimes. And he told the Front Page podcast, I found this quite interesting, that some MPs told him that they had absolutely no knowledge or experience of being lobbied like this or how it works, which I think just goes to show that it really is the government ministers, the policymakers, who are really targeted by these professional lobbyists.
So has Guyan commented on this, these changes that Chris Hipkins has announced? Is he pleased with that result?
Well, I think he must be, because he's had a bit of a result already, and now there is this review in train, and it's been talked about. The opposition have talked about it as well. But here's what he said on that New Zealand Herald podcast, The Front Page, earlier this week.
I think symbolically this white card one is quite a good one for him to target, because it sticks in people's mind, doesn't it? That, these people can get into Parliament whenever they want rather than going in through the front door. But it would still leave us well behind most countries. That's just a fact. That's not a debating point. That's a fact.
So will these changes stick now if National gets into power, if the government changes later this year?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, and it seems so because the National Party has also said it wants this cooling off period introduced, and it also backs this idea of a register. So you would know, for example, which of the professional government relations companies are working for which clients. So also on that same edition of the Front Page podcast, they reported what National's Deputy Nicola Willis had to say with a bit of a slick podcast style soundtrack in the background.
National thinks there should be a stand-down period of 12 months after any minister leaves government. They shouldn't be hired by a lobbying firm the next day with access to politicians. There should be a 12-month stand-down, and we want to stop that revolving door. We'd also like to see a transparent, publicly accountable register of who's doing the lobbying and who they're lobbying for.
So have we heard anything from the lobbyists themselves? Have they commented on this? And I guess would that register address Guyan's other point that lobbyists should have to declare any specific conflict of interest if they had at any given time?
Yeah, particularly if they're commenting in the media. Some are media friendly and like to do this, some like to work in the background. But no, by and large, they've had very little to say about it, which is understandable perhaps. But it's a bit of a shame. One who did, though, was Bridget Morton, who's a National Business Review columnist. Now, she actually made a distinction here. She says that she's a lawyer for the Frank Ogilvy company, but they've been hired by, I think, parties with an interest or a vested interest or a stake in things like Three Waters, for example. So it sounds a little bit like lobbying or representation to me. However, she does draw that distinction. But she says, look, this RNZ series, this is what she wrote in the NBR, did not ask why organisations feel they need to pay lobbyists. Who has increased access to the government, whether there's any wider benefit from lobbyists. These were things that weren't really addressed. So she says, as the government grows, so do the levels of bureaucracy, and it becomes increasingly difficult for people outside that Wellington system, or the Beltway as people like to call it, to understand exactly who is responsible for something, how you untangle a problem. Lobbyists can provide that. And she also said when she did work as a lobbyist, she said she spent about a year doing what she believes to be lobbying work. She said, but like Guyan's point earlier, she was amazed at how many people didn't understand the difference between a minister and a mere member of parliament, let alone, say, a manager or a deputy secretary in a minister's office. She said, there are people I interacted with were some of the brightest minds, these are her words, driving our economy, but they simply didn't have time to turn their minds to working with government and who needed to be contacted. So she says, if we want government and the community working closer together, we shouldn't be creating any artificial barriers between them. So that's her view. But one example of the lobbyist who featured actually quite a lot in Guyan's series was Neil Jones, co-owner of the firm Capital. He's frequently on 9 to Noon's politics panel. Now on Tuesday, normally that's on a Monday, but because of Easter it was on Tuesday, so yesterday as we're speaking, Neil was on it, I think, for the first time since Guyan's series came out. So I listened in to see if anything would be said about it. He was appearing alongside another Chief of Staff, that was Tim Hurdle. But Susie Ferguson, the host, just quickly, about 3 minutes in, felt she needed to sort of give this explanation.
I should also have your disclaimers. Tim Hurdle, a former National Party advisor and also was campaign director for National at the 2020 election. Neil Jones, who's also with us, was Chief of Staff to Labour leader Jacinda Ardern, and prior to that Chief of Staff to Andrew Little and is the Director of Public Affairs firm Capital. Right. Let's also talk about the situation with Te Whatu Ora.
Yeah, so that was pretty much stock standard what they do in the declarations of their positions, and I thought there was a bit of an opportunity there. It was a shame that they didn't take the chance to actually ask Neil a bit about that, or maybe even put him on the spot about individual clients he might have had that may have been relevant. But I think it's just up to them to disclose it or avoid discussions of issues where they've got a direct conflict or a client that puts them in conflict with that.
Have others in the media followed up on this?
Yeah, a little bit. So also on that front page podcast, Georgina Campbell, the Herald journalist, was the host of it this week. She asked Guyon in that interview, look, Guyon, isn't this all about Beltway? Honestly, most people don't really care about who's swiping into Parliament or who's influencing whom. But Guyon was saying, no, this really is about fairness, ensuring that the playing field isn't tilted to those who can afford to hire people who can command the attention of politicians and know exactly who to go to among their staff. And that question of Georgina's about, look, really this is Beltway, it's not a matter for ordinary folks to stress about, was echoed by Joe Moyer, political editor of Newsroom. Now, Newsroom has a new weekly podcast called Raw Politics, which is funded by the public, through the Public Interest Journalism Fund, interestingly. And on last week's edition, so Friday this came out, Joe Moyer gave this opinion of Chris Hipkins' announcements about changing the rules for lobbyists.
I don't know. I just think it's one of those things where Chris Hipkins probably could have held his nerve for another week, and I think that this stuff might have actually kind of disappeared a little bit, and he could have actually just let it go and done nothing. I was surprised that he decided to react in the way that he did, because given the whole sort of, we're a bread and butter government now and we're not going to be distracted by anything, this is an incredibly Beltway issue to be getting distracted by.
So she's basically saying, was it really worth all the effort of changing things?
Yeah, I think so. Either that or that he should just focus on other stuff, as she said there. So she seemed to be seeing it through his eyes just as a political strategy calculation, not really pondering whether this was the right or just thing to do, not worrying about that playing field being tilted, as Guyon was saying, or alternatively that in fact lobbyists like Brigitte Morton said earlier in the NBR can actually be an instrument that evens it up and provides expertise where it could really be best directed, because other people just don't have time to worry about who's the right person to approach. Her colleague actually, Sam Sachdeva, on the same podcast from Newsroom, didn't agree with Joe, and he was saying, look, it's more than a Beltway issue, and even if, so-called voters, as we're often described, I like to think of us as citizens, not just people who vote once every 3 years, but he was saying, look, if this does become something, an exercise people or an issue that's thrown up in an election campaign, Chris Hipkins, says Sam, can now point to it and say, look, I saw there was something needed. I acted quickly, when that series brought stuff to light. So I have done something. But again, I think that's just a political strategy calculation. And, I just don't think that's the right or most helpful way to look at the issue. Because in the same way that there may be people working in public life who don't know how to effectively represent themselves and don't know who to approach in government to have effective kind of influence. Well, citizens won't know that either, and would like people on their behalf to be making good decisions about fairness and justice and political influence and policy making. So, I'm not sure that's quite the response that Guyon and the RNZ in-depth team would be hoping for from other journalists as a result of their series. But one other commentator I think did make a good point. That's Gordon Campbell, long-time journalist and commentator, columnist. He said, look, honestly, look at Australia's code. We should just copy that. It's comprehensive. It works. Just copy it wholesale. But he also made a separate point, Mark. He said, something I hadn't really thought about. He says, it seems incredible to me. New Zealand courts can require a media celebrity to respect the restraint of trade period before starting a new media job, but no such rules appear to cabinet ministers or senior public servants. And that is a reference to Tova O'Brien, who was restrained by her former employers at TV3 or Discovery, the current owners, last year when she tried to join MediaWorks and Today FM. And I think that actually is a point about lobbyists and politicians and that revolving door that will chime with a few journalists.
Now, the PM has also been under pressure to tighten up compliance with the Official Information Act after the Stuart Nash affair. He's also had to respond to journalists' concerns about that lately.
Yeah, so Stuart Nash dismissed from Cabinet after staff published details of an email that he sent to campaign donors. Remember, that was revealing internal Cabinet discussions, big no-no. That was the newsroom political staff that were after that. They requested it in written correspondence. It was withheld from them. They were told it was out of scope. So the Ombudsman will now look at that, and that will take some time. But Chris Hipkins, the Prime Minister, played this down, initially sort of saying that, I'm paraphrasing here really, but saying that it was an oversight. It was a busy time, a poor call was made, and this was just a mistake. Now, that won't satisfy journalists who for years have griped about the spirit of the OIA not being followed or the letter of it. And, they'll say, look, it's really, really not good enough for, on one of the rare occasions that that something was unjustifiably withheld and they find out about it. When that comes to light, it's just not going to say, oh, look, it was a busy time and a staffer made a mistake, won't happen again. Some are even suggesting now that it's time for penalties because this sort of thing has gone on too long, legal penalties. Now, that does have problems because you might end up with scapegoating and blame shifting and so on, junior staffers somehow being made to carry the can for these sorts of mistakes if there are penalties to be applied. But it's interesting that now the temperature is going up and having a look at that. And with that in mind, there was an interesting series actually out this week that shows just how hard, or puts it really in sharp relief, how hard it is to get information which ought to be routinely available. And this is on a big topic of health.
Always a contentious area, health, of course, as it should be, I guess. But tell us about that. What was it about?
Well, this project is another one funded through the Public Interest Journalism Fund, which is running out shortly. And this is by the business news organisation Business Desk, which is a subscriber site, really. So it's called the Business of Health. And what they're trying to do there is sort of lift the lid on the huge amount that gets spent on health, public funds, and where it all goes. So two journalists doing the heavy lifting on this. One's Victoria Young, who previously worked at the National Business Review, and then Cecile Meyer, who is experienced, I think, Christchurch-based former staff business and health reporter who was hired by Business Desk last year.
So what was the purpose of this investigation?
Well, they bill it as these are the words at the top of the page online. So, who is making money out of health? Much has been written about the sector's workforce, the nurses, doctors, etc., who keep the healthcare system ticking over. In this project, we'll seek out answers about how all this really works, but it's run into huge roadblocks trying to find out where the money goes. So they write, we expected it might be tricky to get financial information from the private sector because GPs, for example, have no obligation to open up their books. But we thought that the government would share information and should do on its huge health budget, roughly $30 billion in the current calendar year, being spent and what value we're getting out of it. But they're having trouble even when they put in those official requests.
So in other words, no response to their Official Information Act requests?
Well, some, but not a lot. So the problems are set out in a pretty stark piece called What We Did Not Learn from Te Whatu Ora. So they say between August and November, we sent out a huge number of requests under the OIA to the Health Ministry, former DHBs that are, I guess, being disbanded in Te Whatu Ora. They say there were 18 sent to Te Whatu Ora, for example, for this. 3 were answered within the 20-day deadline. A full or partial response to 9 others were delayed up to 16 weeks. We're still waiting for a response on 5 more. No explanation, they say, for why some of these requests have not been answered.
Mm-hmm. Te Whatu Ora, it's a new agency, isn't it? And it's taken over the functions of the DHBs all around the country. Should media give them a break, cut some slack over those requests if they come in at such a rate of knots, and of course the deadlines as well?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, I believe it has something like about 80,000 employees, or will have when everything's fully integrated. Te Whatu Ora said, according to the business desk own reporting, that it's received more than 1,900 OIA requests in the first 6 months of the agency's existence, which is a lot more than I would have guessed. They say we're trying our best to meet the response times and do effective compliance. And they say they work tirelessly to respond to this huge volume of requests while we're still also recruiting to fully resource the team. But business desk Cecile Meyer was still minded to kind of put that to the test.
So how did she do that?
Well, she asked Te Whatu Ora under the OIA, and I think this is more journalists are doing that when they experience frustration with the OIA, having put in a request and not got satisfaction. They'll often ask, okay, I would like now all the information about the handling of my request, as well as the actual information at source I was requesting. So she's asked them to set out its communications budget, its staffing numbers and pay, and its use of PR consultants. And that has been a hot topic recently with the National Party saying they want to cut back on consultants and save, I think, $400 million a year to fund a lot of other public policy. So that's interesting that they would do that. So Cecile Meyer on the team for the Business of Health project says the response to this was due before Christmas, but the deadline was extended to January the 31st this year. Then they said the response would be sent by March the 3rd, which became the March the 31st. We're still waiting for it now. So frustration, I think, for her, because I guess you've set up a series, you want to be publishing the results, and it's really not coming through fast enough to be effective with those deadlines in mind.
They're not thinking if you just ignore this request that might just go away. I mean, it was at the end of the road for it.
I don't think so, because Cecile's done what a lot of journalists have done when the delays are unexplained or, in their mind, unjustified. They push them on to the Ombudsman. So she's asking for any communication sent since the middle of last year about the handling of media inquiries. So that will be interesting what they get back. But again, she says we're still waiting for a response to that as well. So I guess you've got to play the long game with all of this. But in the background, as they point out themselves in their stories, Rob Campbell, in that furore over his sacking from the agency, he has since said that there are more than 200 such people, comms people, to deal with this stuff, and that PR firms are also being called in to sell the Te Whatu Ora message better. Those are his words. And I think in Parliament last month, the Health Minister, Aisha Verrall, said when quizzed that there were 173 communication staff as well as at least 26 contractors. So that's practically the 200 right there. So sounds to me like enough to be able to respond to, significant and genuine media inquiries.
And I guess what sort of detail does the business desk investigation actually want?
Yeah, good point. So what they really want, I think, is to see what the biggest contracts are. That's a big part of it. So I don't know if you recall last year, or maybe the year before, there were big rows about the quality of hospital food. And so two examples they've cited at Business Desk was Compass Group, that supplies catering to hospitals, a British-based multinational, thousands of meals a day, multi-million-dollar long-term contracts and big profit margins. There's another company called ISS, which is a global company that has, according to Business Desk, more than 350,000 employees in 30 countries. So that's huge. Does cleaning services as well in the health sector. And Cecile Meyer reported that she said there's one DHB, don't know which one, but that saved millions of dollars when it took its hospital catering back in-house after it ended a contract with that firm Compass. So she said they're asking Te Whatu Ora which other districts do their own catering, how are these food services run, how are they saving money. So if they can get details on that, that could be really, really interesting. And there's more, they're researching, the mental health services. Remember, there was, I think, $900 million to that, which had been either not spent or not effectively spent so far. So a lot for them to dig into.
Now, Business Desk, it's an online outlet, isn't it? So you pay a subscription for that. So if you can't afford that, you can't see the investigation, presumably. Is that right?
Effectively so, but no, because it's a publicly funded project from the Public Interest Journalism Fund. They do make that available online for free, so no paywall for that, as there would be with their other content. However, you wouldn't go to Business Desk if you weren't a subscriber, most probably, to be able to see the content. However, these days, Business Desk is owned by NZME, so it sits alongside the Herald's own business section and content. So that may be one way of actually getting a bit more exposure for it. Of course, the Herald also has its own digital paywall for some of its stuff. But also, interesting thing is you can go to the Business Desk site, follow Victoria Young, who I think is in charge of that Business of Health project. If you follow her, you'll get all the articles emailed to you for free as part of the series. So that's what I've done, and I'll keep up with it and see what they get in dribs and drabs via the Official Information Act.
Now, next question. This is intriguing, this wonderful series, which I have been watching, and no spoiler alerts, please, or make sure you don't give anything away here, Colin.
Yes.
It's Succession, of course, which is based on Rupert Murdoch and his family, dysfunctional family. And, well, it's coming to an end, this series, the final series. Have you seen it yourself?
No, I think I'm the last person in media that has. I'm so glad that you have.
You're in the media, for goodness sake.
I know. I've seen a couple, because Prime Television, with their hookup with Sky, obviously same owners, they put some of the older series that everybody had seen and talked about on Prime. So I watched a couple, but I just wasn't able to follow up on it. I will get there, because I like Matthew McFadyen. I think he's a terrific actor. And
Tom,
yeah,
he's great.
And the lots and lots of swearing, love that too. Happy to see bad language, and now that my kids are older, I can get away with playing that out loud on the big TV in the living room. So all good. But I do feel like the only person in the media industry who hasn't actually seen it. But I did laugh about the LA Times, because they did. So I guess in the current episode, so this is a spoiler, is I'm going to get a character passes away, so the LA Times did an obituary for this character, as if it was a real person who died. Even put an editor's note on it saying, this obituary is for a fictional character from Season 4, Episode 3 of Succession. It has been updated with a statement from his fictional children, which is, I think, taking it a little bit far.
So you read it as though it was a genuine article, obituary, as you would standard in any newspaper, but of course the character was completely fictitious. But you would have thought it would have spoilt the surprise for LA Times readers who, didn't want to know, hadn't seen the episode.
Well, I guess it's all in the timing, but it turns out that according to reports, this was published, I guess, on the West Coast before the East Coast of the US had seen the episode, or even in Europe. I think it goes out something like 2 a.m. US time. So for maybe people who live there and have an LA Times subscription, they might have seen it. So they might be aware of this particular plot twist that, from descriptions I see, had people's jaws on the floor. So I don't know quite how staggering it was.
However, well, it was Monday night here. I'll tell you that much, Colin. It was Monday night here, all right?
Well, the Times spokesperson, the LA Times, says, we understand that people who saw our story before they watched the episode may be upset, but we felt the character was so richly conceived that they deserved the proper send-off, and it was important to be part of the conversation in real time. And they claimed they didn't publish anything ahead of the events in the episode and minimise spoilers on their social media accounts. But yeah, clearly judging by the rather colourful social media response, some people still not at all happy with finding out that way through the LA Times.
Now, we've only got 2 minutes to go, Colin. We're heading to the news at 11, but have you got time to talk about the Southland Times and the journalist who's left that paper and founded his own news service?
Yes. This is Logan Savary, who we featured on Mediawatch. He left stuff in the Southland Times. He set up a Substack, his subscriber kind of email system. But every day on his own, he's now passed 50 editions of local news. The Southland Tribune is the name. So it sounds like a masthead that's been around for 150 years. But it's all him. And when I interviewed him, I thought, how long can this really last? But he's really doing it. And also for some paying subscribers who support it, and free stuff for everyone. It's really good.
Yeah, excellent stuff. And is it the sort of stuff that you would see, I keep saying stuff, that you would probably see covered in other outlets? I mean, would his former paper be publishing these items normally?
Yeah, some of them, but he's had a couple of scoops. He had one week before last about Sir Tim Shadbolt getting admitted to hospital for respite care, and that was reported by other media, including RNZ's Midday News, citing the Southern Tribune. He'd have loved that. He does a weekend edition solely focused on Southland sport, and all the sports staff were cut from Stuff's reporters in the region, so filling a gap there. He does Council Watch features, did stuff on that dramatic Gore Council meltdown. So, no, he's really doing the business. So well done, Logan. More than 50 up. Hope it continues, the Southland Tribune.
Fantastic. Well, Colin, great to chat with you, and look forward to your next episode on Sunday morning. And, I'm sure we've got plenty in store for us then.
Plunging lamppost permitting.
Oh, yeah, indeed. Yeah, be careful as you ride home that the lamppost doesn't get you. Thanks for joining us. Colin Peacock there from Mediawatch. He'll be back Sunday morning just after 9.